Thank you, Noah. You know, it's very sweet for me to be with my friends at Upaya. I'm very fond of the community and the residents that are sitting here today. I swear they keep the world on its axis by their sitting. And to my dear friend, Roshi Joan, we've been through it all together, and here we are in yet another pandemic. I find myself scared sometimes these days. Don't you? At least some of the time. I'm scared. You know, when my son was little, my son Gabe was little, and I'd go to put him to bed, sometimes he'd say, "Dad, leave the light on and don't close the door, okay? There's monsters." Now, I could have said to him, "Don't be silly, go to sleep." But I said, "Monsters? Where are they? Are they here in the room?" And he'd shake his head, "Yes." And I went over and I jumped in his bed and I pulled the covers up over both our heads. And I said, "Where are they? Where are they?" And he said, "They're in the closet." I said, "Well, maybe we better stay here under the covers then." He'd say, "Yeah." And after a while I said, "Should we see if they're still there? Should we go see? I'm a little scared, but I'd like to see." And he said, "Okay." And I said, "Okay, let's bring some pillows just in case we need some defense." And so then we got down on the floor and we would crawl over on our hands and knees to the closet. And then we made a deal and I said, "Look, I'm going to open the closet doors. And when I open the closet door really fast, you throw in those pillows to knock down the monsters. We'll see if we can disable them." So we were scared, you know, and I'd count 1, 2, 3. I'd open the door and he threw in the pillows and everything came tumbling down inside the closet. And I shut the door, you know. And then I said, "Should we look?" And he said, "Yeah." And we opened the closet. And sure enough, the only thing we could find there were his toys and his clothes and the bed pillows. I get scared sometimes these days. Don't you? You know, it's not so different for us as grown-ups. The monsters we face might feel bigger or uglier or more challenging than the ones we lived with in our childhood, but I still feel them there. And in a way, we're not so different than my son Gabe. You know, our fears are often boiled down to our stories that we tell ourselves. Like right before this talk, I got scared. I had some strokes a few months back, a series of strokes, and so my brain is quite scrambled. And I can't sort things and I can't sequence things. And it's especially difficult for me when I have to do something with technology, which is what life seems to be all about these days. And so just before I signed on with Noah, my microphone quit. And no matter how I tried, I couldn't make it work. And my mind started spinning with the object of my fear. And immediately I could just see these stories, you know, that I wouldn't be able to connect, that leave you all hanging here. But fortunately, I know something about working with fear. And also, I had a second microphone, so that really helped. But taking fear as our teacher and learning to work skillfully with it, it can lead us to some degree of inner freedom. You know, we quickly see when we're afraid that when we're operating from a place of fear, it means that we actually have very little trust in reality. We're separated from reality, and as such, we're separated from each other. And I think from the possibility of unity. And for a lot of us in this world, that's our default position. You know, in Buddhist circles, that small cut-off sense of ourself, you know, we sometimes refer to it as the body of fear. And it takes a physical form as a kind of shell. That's at least how it feels to me that way anyway. A kind of tension all around me, a stiffening of my body, a thickening of the defenses against the fear. And then my mind gets really rigid and it gets really confused. And my heart closes. I think a separation needs to occur, but it's not the one that we've imagined. In coping with our fear, it's helpful to distinguish our emotional states from the object of which we are afraid. Like my microphone not working. When we obsess about the objects, about microphones or insects or identity or rejection or government interference or pandemics, we avoid contact with the emotion itself. So like monsters in the closet, the thing we fear may not even exist. But all our attention turns that illusion into a kind of reality. But when we discern for even a little bit, even for a moment, the difference between the emotion and the object, we can see the part that we play in the process. And then we can begin to unhook ourselves from the overwhelm. Maybe like me, you shudder a little bit and cry a little bit, and then gradually you begin to relax and temporarily hold the fear in the container of the body supported by steady breathing. And then we can examine the mind, we can watch its operations and its beliefs that are at work and its assumptions and the memories that underpin the fear. And in this way, I think we can reduce our own reactivity. When I was a kid, when I was a teenager, my family was pretty crazy. They were highly alcoholic and there was a lot of violence in the house. And it was always uncertain. I never knew what was going to happen, what kind of explosion would happen, or what kind of beating would happen. And so when I would come home and I'd touch the door handle, to come into my house, I could feel my hands shake. It would just shake, And I didn't know what I'd find on the other side of the door. And so thresholds always scared me, They always scared me. But when we can one of my technologies just broke down. When we can bring some kind of courageous presence through mindfulness practice and touch what frightens us with some kind of mercy and tenderness, that which was previously touched only by fear, another possibility starts to emerge. So when I started to practice, in meditation retreats, they're always asking you to move around mindfully. And so my central practice became opening doors. That became my practice. And gradually, with practice and mindfulness, I could replace my learned hypervigilance that contributed to this fear all the time. And instead, I could enter into a process of healing these really old wounds. Now, fear is a normal reaction and sometimes necessary for our survival, right? In response to a perceived threat, for example, it generates some specific pattern in our bodies and minds. And it's reasonable, we want to protect ourselves and we want to protect those we love, especially these days. But what I see is that living from a place of fear can narrow our vision. It can shrink our lives down to that which is comfortable but isn't necessarily true. And driven by fear alone, we stop using our common sense and we make unwise decisions. So the willingness to sit with our fear at least in my mind, in my heart, is an act of courage. You know, in the old Buddhist texts, they refer to the great and courageous bodhisattvas. We chant the bodhisattva vows at the end of this talk. And these are beings who have the fortitude to stand with suffering that might bring the rest of us to our knees. And it's not that these beings have no fear. Rather, they're able to maintain a courageous presence while they're afraid. They open to their fear. They're willing to hold it, to learn from it, to be transformed by it. And in that way, I think in our lives, fear can serve as a kind of catalyst. At least it has for me. It's become a doorway to compassion and a pathway to transformation. Sometimes people tell me the most horrible stories. And my job is just to bear witness. Like my friend Janet, you know, I've known her for a long time. She's one of the naturally good people I know on the planet. She has an incredibly good heart, but she's also suffered a lot. Many years ago, when her son Jack was very young, she was having a barbecue in her backyard with her husband and their friend Albert and their 2 children. And while they were in the midst of the barbecue, Janet started looking around for the kids and she couldn't find them. So she went out looking for Jack, and she went through the house and she couldn't find him, and she went out in the front yard and she couldn't find him. And then she heard this crash and a scream. And she ran out to the road in front of their house. And there was Jack lying lifeless on the road, and the car had driven off. Oh boy. Her husband and Albert, who was a doctor, they came running through and they scooped up Jack and they put him in the truck and they drove him to the hospital. And there he was laying on Janet's lap, you know, and his leg was broken and it was bleeding. And that's what her primary concern was, you know. And she didn't even realize that Albert was doing CPR on him because he'd stopped breathing. And they got to the hospital and they swept Jack off into the emergency room and immediately connected him to life support. And everybody was frozen in fear. And after some time, the doctors came to Janet and her husband and they said, "We're very sorry, but Jack's injuries were just too severe and the brain injury was just too much. And so we have to disconnect him from life support." And so Janet, this incredible mom, she and her husband went and she held her baby and they disconnected him from life support, and Jack died shortly thereafter. And then they had this long drive home, you know, through the countryside. And the road that took them home, it went along the river. And across the river, she could see the reflection of the full moon. And something about it got her attention, and this awareness opened up in her. And this kind of guidance spoke to her. And it said to her, if I'm ever going to honor Jack's life, I can't let this accident destroy me. If I'm ever going to honor Jack's life, I can't let this accident destroy me. And they got home and the police called to confirm that it was in fact a hit and run. Janet was full of rage. Full of rage. She couldn't sleep all night. And in the morning, there was a knock on the door. Janet opened her door and she looked through the screen door, and instinctively she knew that the man on the other side of the screen door was the driver, the hit and run driver. And looking at this man's anguish, it opened her heart. Years later, she and I talked about the Longfellow Quote. You know, it said that Longfellow wrote, he said, if we could read the secret history of our enemies, we should find in each man, each woman's life, sorrow and suffering enough to disarm all hostility. And that's what happened for Janet. Then this grieving mother, she did the most amazing thing. She invited this man, the hit and run driver, into her living room. And they sat on her couch together. And they talked. And the driver took full responsibility. He said, it was completely my fault. He said, I didn't know that I'd hit your son. He said, my daughter was getting married, and today was the wedding rehearsal, and I was late, and I was driving quickly to try and get to the place of the rehearsal, and I didn't know I'd hit him. But I take responsibility. It's completely my fault. And Janet's sitting there quietly. This kind of guidance, this inner guidance spoke to her again, like it did on the river. And she spoke to the man and she said, Jack's death is the responsibility of us 4 adults. Jack's death was the result of a moment of inattention. Nothing more. Wow. It took a long time for Janet to heal her grief. Neighbors would help. She'd come out some mornings and be a basket of eggs on her doorstep, or flowers, a bouquet of flowers tucked in her door. It took a long time. It wasn't easy. Janet's marriage didn't survive the death of her son. But Janet did. And now she's the person in the community that neighbors come to when there's a death. We are vulnerable human beings. And we tend to like simple causes. We want to tidy up life's uncertainties. We want such accidents to be brought under human control, and we want someone to be held accountable. We want the outrageous and the impossible to be understood so it will somehow alleviate our sense of helplessness. But life doesn't always present itself that way. It's not always right and reasonable. The truth is, we rarely have control over such catastrophes and the twists and turns of fate. And maybe especially not our deaths. I think Janet's like one of the bodhisattvas. It wasn't that she wasn't afraid. It's that she was willing to meet the fear. And I think ordinary people, people like you and me, we put courageous presence into practice every day in small and beautiful ways. Like there's this guy now, his name's Julio, and he's a nurse's aide. He works in a big metropolitan hospital. And when there's been a code in the ER or one of the other operating theaters, it's quite a mess, When the person hasn't survived, they're still there on a gurney, and Julio comes into the room. And his job is to clean up the room. And there's the person on the gurney, you know. And Julio walks over to them and he leans over like in a kind of noble bow to them. And he just whispers in their ear. He says, I want to tell you that you've died. It's okay. In a little while after I clean up the room, I'm going to bathe you. And I'm going to do my best to wash away all dust and confusion. And then he sets about trying to clean up the room. And it's quite chaotic, you know, there's bloody gauze on the floor and the drawers with all the tools and equipment are askew, and he puts everything back in order. And then he starts to bathe the body of the person that's died. And you know, the nursing supervisor sticks her head in the room. She says, we need the room, hurry up. But Julio doesn't rush. And the other nurses, well, they protect Julio because they knew he's doing sacred work and that they should leave him the time to do this work, to bathe this body. Courageous presence. Bodhisattvas everywhere. Bodhisattvas expressing courage everywhere. I want to speak a little bit about courage. The most common image of courage that we have is what we think of as warrior courage, right? It's related to bravery and emergencies and dangerous situations. You know, we could think of soldiers or the first responders who are, you know, working so hard right now. And they demonstrate this vigor and persistence, and their training and their beliefs and sometimes just their adrenaline allow them to take risks and override their fear, or at least not get stopped by it. You know, doctors and nurses and people in the healthcare professions, they get the same kind of training to push through their exhaustion. But for some of us, it's just getting out of bed in the morning is warrior courage. Well, for others, it's to summon the fear to bear emotional turmoil or poverty or living on the margins of society. Or for others of us, it's living with invisible illnesses like chronic fatigue or depression or brain injuries like what I got. But for most of us, just everyday life takes some kind of courage. The courage to choose what we believe is right. So this healthier warrior courage, and it's motivated by honor and loyalty and service and commitment. And that's balanced by intelligence in its application. However, there's also a shadow side of this warrior courage, and it can be aroused by shame and coercion and the need to control or a desire to gain approval or some kind of defensiveness or a false sense of vulnerability. Fearlessness, like we talk about in our practice, is not about eliminating or ignoring or pushing away fear. It's about developing our capacity to be courageously present with these powerful states of mind and heart when we're facing terror, as many of us are these days. We need warrior courage in our practice sometimes to change old habits, to stay present for unimaginable states of mind and heart. But we also need courage of heart. And that's a different kind of fearlessness that requires just as much, if not more, passion as the courage of the warrior. And we find this type of courage when we're lion-hearted in our dedication to staying with what's true in our experience, when we don't reject our experience, and instead we face what's right here, right now. It's a kind of fearless receptivity to what's happening. And that creates the space for us to, I don't know, to recognize, to explore, to metabolize our fear. Then we can include what we wanted to avoid before, what we'd only touch with pity. In my life, in my experience, this courage opens me to a deeper compassion for all beings. We all have fears. We're all scared a lot of the time. And like bodhisattvas, we can stand with others. We can stand with our own fear, and we can stand with others in their fear. There's another kind of courage I want to talk about, and it's more difficult to understand. It's the courage of vulnerability. And this actually is the doorway to the deepest dimensions of our inner nature, of our true nature. Now, mostly we associate vulnerability with weakness or emotional exposure or being susceptible to harm or getting hurt, getting wounded. And those are all true definitions of vulnerability. But vulnerability is not just a curse, it's a blessing. The courage of vulnerability enables us to sit with a friend whose child has died in an accident, and to sense her pain, to listen openly and generously without some kind of bias, without a need to fix it in some way. With vulnerability, we can acknowledge our fear, the fears we have in everyday life, the news of a divorce, some yearning. Vulnerability is not weakness. It's non-defensiveness. And the absence of defense allows us to be wide open to our experience. And less defended, we're less opaque and more transparent. And we become sensitive to the 10,000 sorrows and the 10,000 joys in this life. You see, if we're not vulnerable to pain and loss and sadness, we become insensitive to compassion and joy and love and basic goodness. I mean, the courage to love requires vulnerability. I mean, is there a more vulnerable state than falling in love? I mean, it's full of risk, right? And uncertainty and intensity and intimacy and conflict and truth-telling. Being vulnerable means we're more sensitive, we're more impressionable, we're more receptive to others and to our own inner guidance. We recognize the illusion of control that we've been fooling ourselves with. And that suffering's inevitable. And so, we're invited to loosen our grip around what's inexplicable and unpredictable. And this courage to vulnerability, it opens the door to invulnerability, to our deep nature. And this invulnerability, it's not a stoicism, it's not some immunity to the ups and downs of life. It's not a stance against emotion. It's not some sense of being impenetrable, like we felt when we were teenagers, It's a pure openness. It's an undefended consciousness. And when we step back, we take a backward step and we allow the mind's fear to blow right through us, then we see there's no place for it to stick, no ground for it to land on. And we can drop the struggle and all our unnecessary efforts. And we can rest in a state of defenselessness. And in that state, we recognize that we're not separate, not from anything or anyone. And we can begin to feel that unity emerge. And the fear subsides. And the basic essence of who we are, it shows itself. And this is never damaged. And it doesn't get sick. And it never dies. Entering into the state of vulnerability makes us sensitive to experiencing the pleasure and pains of our bodies. It allows us to feel the fullness of our emotional life, to notice our thoughts. It's not easy to be with all this, to face the root causes of our suffering. To face our tightly constructed selves. But our capacity to be vulnerable makes it possible for us to not only experience these things, but all dimensions of reality. We feel permeable to the way things actually are. And how our identities are not really fixed, that nothing's really permanent. And we see the emptiness in our compulsions and our fixations. So undefended, we're vulnerable to all of it, to all the possibilities of the human existence, including the subtler and deeper dimensions of our being. And paradoxically, this courage of vulnerability brings us to rest in the openness of our ultimate invulnerability. But we can't just jump there. We get there by getting to know our fear. And getting to know our fear isn't some fact-finding tour, Well, what are the things we're afraid of? It's not about that. At least not in my case, anyway. That kind of fact-finding just proves insufficient. To transform fear into courageous presence, we need love. In my reductionist world, sometimes I just think love and fear are two sides of the same coin. Fear is the contraction side of the coin, and love's the expansive side of the coin. Can we befriend fear? Can we meet it with some mindfulness? Can we touch the suffering it causes with some mercy and compassion? Can we cultivate some loving equanimity that will allow us to stay with it so we can find a place of rest even in the fear? Choosing to love our fear speaks to a trust, a basic trust in the benevolence of reality, in the goodness of reality, in something larger than our fear. And still, we need to feel safe. Sometimes we need to feel safe to investigate. The great English pediatrician and psychologist Donald Winnicott, he developed this concept. He called it the holding environment. And it was foundational to attachment theory, and contemporary psychoanalysis. And he saw that the mother's ability to hold a child was a prerequisite to a child's healthy development. That loving a baby in a way in which it could feel cared for and understood and continuously adored was important. That when a child's loved like that, it can develop a sense of trust in the other, in this case, the mother or the mothering person. And then it extends that to other people in the world. You know, like watch a child just starting to walk, a little toddler, you know, and they stumble on down the sidewalk or across the grassy lawn, you know, and they fall down, right? And they get all freaked out and they cry. And somebody comes along, a mother or father, someone comes along, and they scoop them up and they hold them. It's the holding environment. They love them. And then they set them down again. And sure enough, you know, that little one, they get the courage to try again. And often, very frequently, they can go a little further than the last time. They can move beyond their previous boundaries. I remember when my son Gabe was really young, right after he was born, the midwives were still there, and he just started crying in an uncontrollable way. And his mom was exhausted, and the midwives, even though they had a lot of skill, they couldn't console him. And I said, I know I'm just a guy, but let me try, you know. And I scooped him up and I held him against my chest, and I brought him outside into the space under the night sky, you know. And I just rocked him back and forth. I told him how much I loved him, and that he could always rely on that, and that he was safe in my arms. And I sang to him the song I would sing to him when he was in utero, you know, in his mom's belly. That was a kind of holding environment, you know. Suppose, I wonder, all of us sitting here in the Zendo, suppose we thought of our awareness as a kind of holding environment, or the Zendo as a kind of holding environment. And imagine if when we meditated, we first established ourselves in the posture, of course, as we always do, in our intention for the practice, and we would pay attention to our body and breath. And then maybe we would evoke some kind of loving attention in a way that fosters trust. Like often for me, when I sit, I try and evoke a kind of warm presence of a archetypical mother or grandmother more often. And sometimes I recite, you know, that segment from the Metta Sutta, the Sutta on Loving Kindness. Even as a mother at a risk of her life watches over and protects her only child, so with a boundless heart should we cherish all living beings, suffusing love over the entire world. I believe that when we feel a safe holding like that, when we know that we're resting in awareness and we're in a container of the Zendo, it allows our fear and our pain and our ugliness to come out and show itself, and then to be gently held without judgment, so that they can be healed, those aspects of ourself can be healed. And then we can feel the support, the courage to go beyond our previously limiting stories, our beliefs about what we think we're capable of, who we think we actually are. And that enables us to face a seemingly impossible situation, like the death of a child. So awareness itself can become a resting place. Awareness itself can become a resting place. This is how we cultivate a loving presence, a courageous presence. We begin with ourselves. We create a loving, holding environment that whenever needs to occur, can occur. And it's held in kindness, seen clearly, with a clear mind and an open heart. Suppose awareness was a loving, holding environment Suppose the Zendo was a loving, holding environment. Could awareness itself become your ultimate resting place? Thank you so much for your practice. Thank you for keeping the world on its axis through your practice. Thank you for your gentle and kind attention to me and for sitting with me in my fear. I could feel your kindness. So thank you.